Okay, so you're here because you want to really get to the heart of things, right? Cut through all the noise and figure out what actually matters. That's what we're all about today.
We're going to be diving deep into some excerpts from a recent Elon Musk podcast.
Yeah, we're talking a wide-ranging conversation covering so much ground, and we've gone through it all, pulled out the really key insights, the stuff you'd want to bring up at a dinner party, just to sound incredibly informed.
Basically, consider this your crash course in accelerated learning on everything from how video games can actually impact your brain in surprising ways
Hmm.
to the whole crazy debate about social media and who gets to control what information we see. You know,
We're going there.
we are. And then we're going to dig into those narratives that are shaping the political scene right now.
And look at some of the concerns people have about whether democracy is really, working the way it's supposed to.
And to top it all off, we're going to peek into the future with some of the most cutting-edge tech out there, so buckle up.
Yeah, it's a lot. But by the end of this deep dive, you're going to have a crystal clear understanding of the most important points. I guarantee it.
So why don't we start with something that might just completely flip your perspective on its head? Video games.
Ah, yes, the classic time waster, the enemy of productivity.
Right. I mean, most people just see them as a bit of mindless fun.
A way to zone out after a long day.
Exactly. But one really interesting angle that came up in our source material was this whole idea that the really immersive video games, the ones where you're totally locked in, they can actually create a state of calm focus.
Interesting.
They were making comparisons to the kind of concentration you need in martial arts, or even a seriously focused game of pool.
It's that feeling of being completely absorbed, right? Like nothing else exists in that moment except the game.
Yeah, you're so engaged that everything else just fades away. And here's where it gets really wild. They brought up this study that was done on surgeons. Surgeons who play video games regularly. And guess what? Compared to their colleagues who don't game, they made 32% fewer errors.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
Right. They completed their procedures 24% faster,
Oh my God.
and their overall performance scores were 26% higher.
Seriously, just from playing video games.
It seems that way. What they were really pointing to was the connection between the skills you develop in video games, like precise hand-eye coordination and lightning-fast reaction times, and how those translate to surgical skills.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. I mean, it's not a huge leap when you think about it.
No, not at all.
And this actually led to them kind of throwing out this idea of what if we started incorporating video games into medical training?
It sounds crazy at first, but when you hear those stats, you can't just dismiss it.
Right, absolutely.
And this is what led to one of the speakers sharing a personal story about being a top Quake player. You know those old school first-person shooter games?
Oh, yeah, I remember Quake.
And apparently he was so good that the level of focus he needed was insane. Like it even came before his schoolwork at times.
Wow. That really shows you how much mental effort goes into those high-level competitive games. It's not
Yeah.
just passively sitting on a couch.
Nope. And there's this funny anecdote about the writers on the show News Radio.
Oh, I love that show.
Apparently, they got totally hooked on Quake, like super addicted. And it got to the point where they had a T1 line installed in the writer's room.
A T1 line, that's like some serious internet back in the day.
Right. Just so they could play Quake without any lag. That's dedication.
It really speaks to how captivating those virtual worlds can be. You get completely sucked in.
Yeah. They even compared it to golf, which they felt was way too slow-paced in comparison, probably because it doesn't have that constant barrage of feedback and sensory overload that you get in a video game.
It's true.
Huh?
There's something about all the visuals and sounds and split-second decisions you have to make that just keeps you on edge.
Totally. And then they brought up this idea of using a really difficult video game setting as a way to assess someone's mental acuity.
Oh, wow. So how they handle pressure and react under stress, that's pretty interesting.
Right. It's like a whole new way of thinking about what video games can tell us about a person.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if we haven't been too quick to dismiss them as just pure entertainment. Maybe there are some hidden cognitive benefits we're only just starting to understand.
All right, so let's switch gears now and talk about a topic that's been at the center of a lot of heated debates lately.
Yeah.
Social media and the whole censorship issue.
Yeah, the acquisition of Twitter, which is now X, was a major turning point in all of this, with the whole goal of creating a platform that's all about free speech.
Right, because one of the big concerns that kept coming up was this idea that censorship is on the rise and that there are these deliberate attempts to control what information we're allowed to see.
Exactly. They specifically pointed to things like the suppression of that whole Hunter Biden laptop story. Remember that? Where 51 former intelligence officials basically came out and said it was all Russian disinformation.
Oh, yeah, that was wild.
And then there was the deplatforming of a sitting president, which was unprecedented.
Yeah, that was a huge deal. And one of the speakers actually shared a personal observation about Twitter.
Really?
Yeah. He said he started noticing some weird patterns in his own engagement on the platform even before the acquisition, just based on the fact that he had a really high interaction rate.
So it's like something was off.
Yeah, he felt like things were being manipulated behind the scenes. And then when they deplatformed Trump, it just confirmed his suspicions.
Hmm. That's really interesting to hear that firsthand perspective,
Eh.
especially because he was pointing out that Trump's posts at the time, while definitely controversial, did include calls for calm and nonviolence.
Right. But then, of course, you have the other side of the argument. The people who say those calls for calm were actually dog whistles.
Meaning like a coded message with a hidden meaning for a certain audience.
Exactly. But that interpretation was quickly shut down as being completely ridiculous. And then they brought up the whole issue of agent provocateurs at protests.
Oh, right. The idea that there are people intentionally trying to stir up trouble and make things more chaotic.
Yeah, which is always a possibility. But then after the acquisition, things got even crazier. There was that massive advertiser boycott.
Oh, yeah, that was a big deal. And a lot of it was organized by these left-leaning NGOs like the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which was described as a total scam organization.
Like a Ministry of Truth kind of thing.
Yeah, trying to control the narrative and silence anyone they disagree with. And obviously that boycott had a huge financial impact.
Right. It definitely contributed to this whole story that the platform's owner was a terrible businessman, regardless of whether you agree with the boycott or not.
And speaking of potential influence, let's not forget about the government. They brought up that example of the Department of Justice suing SpaceX for discriminatory hiring practices.
Oh, yeah. What was that about?
Apparently, they were accused of not hiring asylum seekers.
Really?
Yeah. But the thing is, there are these ITAR regulations. That stands for International Traffic in Arms Regulation.
Okay.
And these regulations basically control the export of anything related to defense technology, which rocket technology definitely falls under. And because of that, hiring non-permanent residents can be restricted.
So it was like a catch-22 situation.
Totally. Like, damned if you do, damned if you don't. And they compared it to Stalin's secret police. You know, that whole show me the man and I'll show you the crime mentality.
Oh, yeah, I get it. So the idea is that if the government wants to target you, they'll find a way regardless of the rules.
Exactly. Which is a pretty unsettling thought.
Yeah.
And then they moved on to this whole discussion about alleged hoaxes that were supposedly promoted by the Democratic Party.
Oh, boy, here we go.
I know, right? But it's important to understand their perspective. They brought up things like the whole fine people controversy surrounding Trump's remarks,
Yeah, I remember that.
where critics were saying he was equating white supremacists with counter-protesters. But supporters argued that if you look at his full statement, it's clear that's not what he meant.
Right. There's always that issue of taking things out of context.
Exactly. And then they talked about the misinterpretations of his comments about protecting women from illegal immigrants, claiming that he was dehumanizing all immigrants.
Which, again, is a distortion of what he actually said.
And then there was that rumor that he wanted to execute Liz Cheney, which turned out to be completely false.
Yeah, I remember that one. That was crazy.
And they put a lot of the blame for spreading these narratives on the traditional media outlets.
Yeah, they were pretty harsh on the media.
Well, their point was that without platforms like X offering alternative viewpoints, those narratives could basically take over completely. And they even suggested that YouTube might have been throttling an interview with Trump.
Interesting. So they see X as a kind of counterforce to this potential monopoly on information.
Yeah, that's the idea. And what's interesting is that they pointed out how other platforms like Facebook seem to be loosening up their content moderation policies.
Maybe in response to what X is doing?
Possibly. Like they're seeing the writing on the wall.
It's like a free speech arms race.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And when it comes to fighting misinformation, they really emphasize the importance of going back to the source material. Like, don't just believe what someone tells you. Go and check it out for yourself.
Right. Always fact check.
And they highlighted the value of X's community notes feature. You familiar with that?
Yeah, it's like a crowdsourced fact-checking system, right?
Exactly. Where users can contribute notes and evidence to provide context for tweets. And what's great is that it's completely open and transparent. Even the platform owner can be fact-checked.
So there's no special treatment?
Nope. It's all about putting the power in the hands of the users to evaluate information for themselves.
Okay, let's shift gears again and dive into the whole world of political narratives and media bias, which is always a fun topic.
Right. Always guaranteed to be a civil and nuanced discussion.
Haha, yeah. So one of the things they brought up was this claim that the First Amendment itself is actually an obstacle to fighting misinformation. And they attributed this view to figures like Ketanji Brown Jackson and John Kerry.
Which is a pretty bold statement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But their counterargument was that tools like community notes, along with the basic right to respond with your own evidence and perspective, are actually much more effective ways to deal with misinformation without having to restrict free speech.
Makes sense.
And they completely dismissed the idea that people are too stupid to figure out what's true and what's not.
Right. That's a pretty condescending argument when you think about it.
Totally. And then they went on to criticize the lack of accountability in the established media.
Oh yeah, they did not hold back.
They brought up examples of reporting that later turned out to be false, like Rachel Maddow's coverage of COVID vaccines, or the whole Russiagate saga. And their point was that there are rarely any consequences for these mistakes.
Yeah. No apologies, no retractions, just move on to the next story.
Exactly. And that's a problem, because it erodes trust in the media.
Absolutely. And speaking of trust issues, one of the speakers actually shared their own personal experience of moving away from the left politically.
Really? Why was that?
They felt like the modern left has become too focused on restricting speech they disagree with, and that they're more interested in promoting systems that prioritize things like race and sex over individual merit.
That's an interesting perspective. And then they got into specific examples of what they saw as misleading narratives.
Yeah, like they talked about this one instance where a Trump rally was labeled a Nazi rally, despite the fact that there were Israeli flags and Jewish speakers present.
Wow.
And they contrasted that with MSNBC's coverage of the same event, which apparently drew comparisons to Nazi rallies in the 1930s, but completely ignored Democrat rallies that were held in the same location.
So the implication is that there's a double standard.
Exactly. And they argued that these kinds of narratives are specifically designed to target voters who don't have the time or energy to do their own research.
The low information voter.
Right, who are easily swayed by emotionally charged rhetoric. And then they got into the whole impact of the Twitter files.
Oh, yeah, those are huge.
So for those who don't know, the Twitter files are a bunch of internal documents that were released after the platform was acquired. And they revealed some pretty shocking stuff.
Yeah, they did.
Like instances where government agencies were basically pressuring Twitter to censor certain content.
Really?
Yeah. And they suggested that the old leadership at Twitter, which was described as being very left-leaning, was totally open to this kind of influence and might have even been getting paid for it.
Wow.
Which raises some serious questions about the relationship between big tech and the government.
It does. And the stuff about the FBI's magic portal into Twitter's systems and the fact that they were automatically deleting communications that violated federal law after just 2 weeks, that's pretty scary stuff.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what else is going on behind the scenes.
And they talked about the backlash they faced for releasing the Twitter files, like losing advertising revenue.
Yeah, despite the fact that they were exposing potential government overreach. And they pointed out the irony of the situation, saying that the left, which has historically been very critical of government secrecy, didn't seem to care as much when it was their side doing the censoring.
Interesting. And then the conversation shifted to the whole controversy surrounding the lab leak theory of COVID's origin.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole rabbit hole.
It is. And they brought up that viral clip of Jon Stewart talking about the novel coronavirus research institute in Wuhan. And there was a lot of criticism directed at Dr. Fauci and Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s book, The Real Anthony Fauci.
Yeah, that book was really controversial.
It was. But they pointed out that despite all the criticism and the accusations, it hadn't been hit with a bunch of lawsuits.
Which is interesting. You'd think if the claims were totally baseless, someone would have sued by now.
Right. And then they brought up the whole issue of Fauci's alleged role in funding gain-of-function research in Wuhan through EcoHealth Alliance.
Which is basically research that's designed to make viruses more dangerous.
Yeah. And they mentioned how Obama had actually tried to stop this kind of research at one point, but it seems like it continued anyway.
Yeah. And they even went so far as to describe gain-of-function research as death maximization.
Wow.
Which is a pretty strong statement. But it shows you how serious they are about this issue. And then they got into the whole COVID response in general.
Which was a mess in a lot of ways.
Yeah, they were pretty critical of the rapid development and rollout of the vaccines under Operation Warp Speed.
Saying that there wasn't enough long-term testing.
Right. And that dissenting scientific opinions were suppressed.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of pressure to conform to the mainstream narrative.
And they also slammed the practice of pharmaceutical companies directly advertising to consumers,
Yeah.
calling it a profit scam.
Which it kind of is when you think about it.
And they brought up examples of what they saw as misleading claims about vaccine efficacy and safety.
Yeah, there were definitely some questions about the data.
And they talked about how people who dared to question the narrative were ostracized and labeled as anti-vaxxers.
Even if they weren't actually against vaccines in general.
Right. It was like you couldn't even have a nuanced conversation about it. And while they said they generally support vaccines, they were very skeptical of the pharmaceutical industry.
Given their history of criminal behavior.
Yeah. They brought up the Vioxx scandal, where internal documents showed that the company knew about the risks of heart attacks and strokes, but kept selling the drug anyway.
That was a huge scandal.
And they pointed out that a surprisingly high percentage of FDA-approved drugs end up being pulled from the market eventually.
Wow, really?
Yeah, which kind of makes you wonder about the whole approval process. And they contrasted that with the resistance to using MDMA for therapy.
For things like PTSD in veterans.
Right. Which they argued has shown a lot of promise, but is still facing a lot of hurdles. And then they kind of went off on a tangent about drug addiction.
Yeah, that was an interesting part of the conversation.
One of them shared some personal anecdotes suggesting that opioids and alcohol might not be addictive for everyone.
That's a controversial take.
It is. And they even threw out this idea of judging drugs based on whether they make you a better person.
That's a pretty wild metric.
I know, right?
Ugh.
But it shows you how outside the box they're thinking. And they talk about how the illegality of drugs like fentanyl actually makes them more dangerous.
Because it drives the market underground.
Exactly,
Yeah.
where there's no quality control and people are more likely to overdose. But they acknowledge that legalizing drugs is a very complex issue.
Yeah, there are a lot of factors to consider.
They also compared Adderall to low-grade amphetamine
Which it basically is.
and talked about its potential for negative side effects. And they even brought up the fact that the Nazis used methamphetamines extensively during World War II. It was like a whole history lesson on drugs. And then they told this funny story about John McAfee.
Oh, yeah, the antivirus software guy.
Yeah, who is apparently a bit of an eccentric character.
Yeah.
They said he was cooking meth and playing Russian roulette.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it was a wild story. But it just goes to show you that some people have a very different relationship with drugs.
That's for sure. Okay, let's move on to a topic that's incredibly important and potentially has huge consequences for all of us. Threats to democracy.
Yeah, this is where things get really serious.
They specifically highlighted the upcoming election in Pennsylvania as being a critical linchpin.
Meaning that it could determine the outcome of the whole election.
Right. And they expressed a lot of concern about what they see as attacks on the Constitution.
Particularly the First Amendment.
Yeah. They're worried that it's being portrayed as a tool for spreading disinformation and misinformation.
Which they see as an attempt to silence dissenting voices.
Exactly. And they really emphasize the importance of both the First and Second Amendments.
Saying that the right to free speech and the right to bear arms are essential for protecting our freedom.
And they brought up this situation in the UK where thousands of people have been arrested for things they've posted online.
Even if their posts weren't directly inciting violence.
Yeah. Which is a pretty scary thought.
It is. It's like the thought police are becoming a reality.
And then they got into this whole theory about the Democratic administration intentionally importing illegal immigrants into swing states.
Yeah. They claim that they've seen data from government websites showing massive increases in immigration in these key states, like triple-digit increases in some cases.
Really? That much?
Yeah. And they argued that this is a deliberate strategy to shift the demographics of these states in favor of Democrats.
So they can win elections more easily.
Right. And they used California as an example.
Which is now basically a one-party state.
Yeah. And they pointed to the law that makes it illegal to require ID for voting.
Which they see as a way to make it easier for people to vote illegally.
Exactly. Yeah. And they said that the only logical explanation for this law is that Democrats want to cheat.
Wow. That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. And they went on to say that this upcoming election is our last chance to save democracy in America.
No pressure.
And they interpreted the fact that the left seems unwilling to address this argument about illegal immigration as proof that it's true. And
Interesting.
then they got into the whole issue of how immigrants tend to vote Democrat.
Which is a pretty well-established pattern.
Right. And they talked about how it's partly due to the perception that Democrats are more likely to provide benefits and support family-based immigration,
And they brought up historical examples like Reagan's amnesty in California.
which led to a huge shift in the state's political landscape.
Yeah, California used to be a lot more purple.
It did. And they talked about personal conversations they'd had with people who just refuse to believe this is happening.
It's like they're in denial.
Yeah. They don't want to acknowledge the possibility that their worldview might be wrong.
And then they brought up that whole Diddy Party list controversy
Yeah, that was weird.
where a bunch of celebrities were supporting Kamala Harris despite the allegations against Diddy.
Yeah. It raised some questions about their judgment. And the Babylon Bee actually did a pretty funny satire piece on it.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. It was hilarious.
It was. And they brought up the theory that maybe there's some kind of Epstein-type compromise deal going on.
Where Diddy has some dirt on these celebrities and is using it to blackmail them into supporting Harris.
Yeah, that's the idea. And they said that it's an open secret in the music industry that Diddy is abusive.
Wow. That's pretty disturbing.
It is. And they contrasted the relatively muted reaction to immigrants being sent to small towns with the outrage over a few busloads of immigrants arriving in Martha's Vineyard.
Which is a very wealthy liberal enclave.
Exactly. And they highlighted the importance of people like RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard Vivek, and Trump in challenging the mainstream narrative.
The people who are willing to speak truth to power.
Right. And they expressed concern that if Harris becomes president, she'll try to silence all dissenting voices.
So they see this election as a battle for the future of free speech.
Yeah, that's a big part of it.
Okay, let's wrap things up with a quick look at the future of technology and how it's going to impact society.
So good.
So first of all, they addressed the rumors about a Tesla phone.
Oh, yeah, I've heard those.
And they confirmed that there are no plans for Tesla to get into the smartphone market anytime soon.
Okay.
They're focused on electric vehicles, autonomous driving humanoid robots, and sustainable energy solutions.
Like their Megapack and Powerwall batteries
Yeah.
and solar technology.
Right. But they did talk about the dominant position of companies like Apple in the phone market and YouTube in online video.
Yeah, those are some pretty powerful players.
And they saw the move of Tucker Carlson's show to X as a pretty significant development.
Potentially normalizing long-form video content on the platform.
Exactly. And they talked about the integration of Grok AI into X.
Which is supposed to be this AI that can generate humorous responses without all the woke baggage.
Yeah, they said it's still in early testing, but they're working on an unhinged mode.
So it can really let loose.
Exactly. And they even threw out some predictions about humanoid robots potentially outnumbering humans in the next 20 years.
Wow, it's a mind-blowing thought.
It is, but it shows you how fast technology is advancing. And they talked about how powerful smartphones are today and how Starlink is going to change the game with in-flight internet connectivity.
Yeah, no more crappy airplane Wi-Fi.
And they mentioned the Starlink Mini and direct-to-cell technology, which will allow basic communication on regular phones via satellite.
So you don't even need a special phone.
Right. And they compared that to the new iPhone's limited satellite text messaging feature.
Which is pretty basic in comparison.
And then they get philosophical about the long-term future of civilization.
This is where things get really deep.
They expressed hope that we'll survive the next 100 years.
While acknowledging Stephen Hawking's prediction that we have a 1% chance of annihilation each year.
Yeah, those are not great odds.
And they talked about the possibility that civilization might actually become less capable over time.
Like a regression rather than progress.
Exactly. And they emphasized the importance of learning from historical collapses, so we don't repeat the same mistakes.
Good point.
And they ended on a somewhat optimistic note, saying that they believe this election is a chance to course correct.
To get things back on track.
But they stressed that it's going to take everyone's participation.
Yeah, we all have a role to play in shaping the future.
Absolutely. And ultimately, they said the fundamental issue at stake in this election is freedom.
The freedom to think for ourselves.
To speak our mind.
To choose our own path.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just recap what we've covered. We've seen how intense video games can actually have some surprising cognitive benefits. We've explored the ongoing battle for free speech on social media platforms. We've examined the pervasive influence of biased narratives in our political discourse. And we've looked at the very real concerns about the future of democratic processes.
And the potentially revolutionary impact of emerging technologies. It's a lot to process.
It is. And it leaves us with one final question to ponder. In the face of all these rapid transformations and challenges, what role will you choose to play in shaping the future? How will you engage with information? How will you exercise your freedoms? And what responsibility do you feel to contribute to the direction of both our society and the technologies that are so intertwined with our lives? It's something to really think about.
It is, because the future is in our hands.
Yeah, it is.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more explorations into the topics that matter.
See you next time.